Good afternoon, everyone. This is a webcast or podcast with Professor and Dr. Steve Hanke. And I would be hosting, and the main language of communication would be English, where we are going to be translating the answers of Dr. Hanke or the most important points. Thank you, Dr. Hanke, for coming in this virtual Montenegro and allowing us to know more about issues with use of the euro in Montenegro. There is no best person in the world that can answer on these issues than you, because you were the main, I would say, the person that constructed this monetary mechanism that Montenegro does, and it probably served us very well. But I would say the engine is maybe changing the speed. Before this, I would just formally announce Dr. Hanke, just for audience to know who Dr. Hanke is. He is Professor of Applied Economics at Johns Hopkins University. He was named one of the top 25 most influential economists in the world in 1998, and today is ranked fourth the most influential economist of the Focus magazine. He is one of the foremost experts on hyperinflation, currency wars, dollarization in the world, within his institute that is very famous and probably the leading institution in the world. He received 7 honorary doctorates from around the world and 4 honorary professorships on the topics of inflation, hyperinflation, and similar. He's, besides of academic world, he was very successful commodity and currency trader, and did very well back in the 80s, and he was one of the best performing traders in Toronto Trust in Buenos Aires. Professor Hanke was the member and of President Ronald Reagan Council of Economic Advisors. He has been involved heavily with various reforms, monetary primarily in Latin America, Asia, and in the Balkans. Notably, that is important for the Balkans. He was more or less advisor for all the governments from 90s until the start of 2000 in Yugoslavia, starting with being personal economic advisor to Živko Pregl. He was at that time Deputy Minister of Yugoslavia. He was advisor to President Stoyanov of Bulgaria. He was advisor to President of Montenegro, Milo Đukanović, special advisor to Gramos Paško in Albania, and he was also instrumental while Bosnia and Herzegovina was introducing Deutschmark by itself. He wrote extensively on dollarization and hyperinflation, but primarily what is important for our region, he did a book with Željko Bogatić together on dollarization, and in 1998, which was in a sense a base for dollarization. This is a short introduction for Dr. Hanke. Thank you again for coming to this, and I would give you a floor. The way how this webinar is told to be, we are going to have a lot of people following us on the various platforms. We are going to be answering our questions, but I would take one question for me, and that would be the first. As you really have a great experience in the Balkans and Yugoslavia, and you were instrumental and knowing many of these reformist people in 1991, and then you were setting up the currency in 1999. Can you please tell us how this historically was happening? As we are in the Balkans and in Montenegro, I would say we don't have full insights of how things are hidden. We are still, I would say, under this communist umbrella, where a lot of things are done and without much public attention. So welcome, Dr. Hanke, and please continue.
Well, good to be with you, Miloš. I wish I was in Montenegro right now, next to the sea, having good fish for my meals and etc. Mrs. Hanke and I like Montenegro very much. So in any case, let me give you just a little background because especially the younger people like you don't really know what actually was going on.
Right.
It was very chaotic. The as communism started to collapse. And much of this actually really isn't written down any place. The important things that were happening. For example, when I first started...
Mr. Hanke, just to give a quick translation of what you said. Dakle, zdravo Miloše, drago mi je što sam ovdje, volio bih da sam tamo sa tobom u Crnoj Gori i htio bih samo za mlađu populaciju posebno da dam jedan kraći uvod o tome šta se dešavalo na ovom prostoru 90-ih. Stanje je bilo haotično. Okay, you can continue.
So I'll do this in kind of, since there is translation that's going to be involved and it's not simultaneous, I'll try to do things in a kind of abbreviated style, shall we say.
We appreciate that.
Thank you.
So what I will do is tell you a little story about my own experience in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and that will set the stage, and you'll understand how chaotic everything was, and why most of this never really has been even written down or recorded.
Dakle, ispričat ću vam jednu kraću priču o svom iskustvu iz Jugoslavije 90-ih, čisto da vam pružim utisak koliko je sve u to vrijeme bilo haotično i zašto većina stvari koje su se tada dešavale nisu uopšte ni zabilježene u nekim zvaničnim dokumentima. Yep.
So let's start to give you a little flavor, a little colorful thing of the thing. In 1989, in the fall of 1989, one of our good friends from Austria, Daniel Swarovski, you probably know the Swarovski crystals. Well, the head of that was a very good friend of ours, Mrs. Hanke and myself, and he invited us to dinner in Vienna, and one of the guests invited for the dinner was Pregl. And Pregl was not only the vice prime minister of former Yugoslavia, he was the head of the league. That's very important. He was the head of the league, the Communist League.
Dakle, 1989. godine gospodin Daniel Swarovski, prijatelj moj i moje žene, nas je pozvao na večeru. Jedan od gostiju na toj večeri je bio gospodin Pregl, zamjenik premijera tadašnje Jugoslavije, jedan od glavnih igrača u to vrijeme.
Now, little did I know at the time we had our dinner that had been arranged by Swarovski that what Pregl really had in mind, and Pregl asked if he could have a private meeting with me the next morning after dinner, and so I said yes. And the topic of the meeting was a discussion with Pregl, and Pregl invited me to be his advisor at that morning meeting, and my response was no.
Dakle, ja nisam imao pojma šta se gospodinu Preglu motalo po glavi. On je me za večerom pozvao da imamo jedan privatan sastanak nas dvojice sutradan ujutru i ujutru mi je saopštio da je htio da ja budem njegov savjetnik, što sam ja odbio.
So why did I say no? I said no simply because I didn't think it would work. Pregl was the head of the Communist League, and I was a free market economist, and I didn't think. I thought we'd be talking about oil and water. And Pregl then said no. That's exactly why he wanted me, and I identified me as being someone he wanted to privatize things, liberalize things, open Yugoslavia up. That's what the Markovic government was trying to do, and he thought I would be a good advisor. So we ended our meeting and that trip to Vienna with me saying no.
Dakle, ja sam mislio da to neće moći da funkcioniše, jer gospodin Pregl je u to vrijeme bio predsjednik komunističke partije, a ja sam bio ekonomista koji se bavio slobodnim tržištem. Međutim, to je upravo i bio razlog zbog kojeg je gospodin Pregl želio da ja budem njegov savjetnik, jer je on želio da uvodi neke reforme. Ja sam mislio da ćemo da pričamo o nafti ili o vodi.
So in January of 1990, or it might have been December, I can't remember if it was December or January, December of 1989 or January of 1990, the World Bank was sending a mission to Belgrade, and a little problem developed because the Yugoslav government said that they would not accept the World Bank mission unless I was on the mission.
Dakle, ne mogu tačno da se sjetim da li bilo u decembru ili u januaru 89. 90. Svjetska banka je htjela, odnosno Jugoslavija je zahtijevala od Svjetske banke da pošalje misiju u Beograd. Svjetska banka nije htjela da pošalje tu misiju ukoliko ja ne bih bio njen dio.
So I received a call from the White House, and my friend at the White House said, asked if I would do a favor for President H.W. Bush at the time, and that is that I would join the mission, because I wasn't working for the World Bank. I had nothing to do with the World Bank, but they wanted me to go because it was creating a diplomatic problem, because Yugoslavia would not accept the mission unless I was on the mission. So I said, yes, I will join the mission. And when we arrived...
Excuse me.
Okay.
Dakle, dobio sam poziv iz Bijele kuće. Tad sam radio za administraciju starijeg predsjednika Busha. Zamoljen sam da budem dio ove misije, jer u suštini Jugoslavija nije htjela da prihvati misiju Svjetske banke ako ja ne budem u njoj, a ja u to vrijeme nisam uopšte radio za Svjetsku banku. Tako da sam pristao.
Of course, Prego was completely behind all of this, and when we arrived in Belgrade, he again invited me to become an advisor, and that time he convinced me that he was going to break up the league, and the Communist Party would collapse, and we'd start a big reform program, and so I agreed, and in January of 1990, I became Pregel's personal advisor in the former Yugoslavia.
Dakle, gospodin Pregel je definitivno bio iza svega ovoga. Opet me je pozvao da budem savjetnik. Rekao je da će se komunistička partija vjerovatno raspasti i htio je da sprovodi reforme, tako da sam ja u januaru 1990. pristao da budem savjetnik gospodina Pregla.
So, among other things, we did a tremendous amount of work. I wrote equivalent of about 3 or 4 books on reform in Yugoslavia, and of course, among other things, that's the first time I went to Titograd. Then, that's the first time I was in Montenegro. It was Titograd. It wasn't Podgorica. So that gives you a little bit of a feel for how things were working. There were many informal connections. Things were not really very well organized, shall we say. And then, of course, the Civil War started in 1991, and that was the end of Yugoslavia. But it was a start, actually, of something more interesting in a way, and that is Montenegro, and I became a state councilor in Montenegro, so I was part of the government in 1999, and that was largely associated with the work I was doing with Bogatic. Bogatic was at the IMF then, and Bogatic and I actually wrote a book that was published in Podgorica on currency reform. And that book, Bogatic and I wrote that in about 10 days. We worked day and night.
Excuse me. Dakle, uradili smo puno toga. Veliki posao smo odradili, napisao sam 3-4 knjige o reformi u to vrijeme. Sve je bilo dosta loše organizovano, bilo je puno neformalnih sastanaka i onda naravno 1991. počeo je građanski rat i to je bio kraj Jugoslavije, ali tada je počela jedna mnogo interesantnija priča o Crnoj Gori. U to vrijeme sam prvi put i došao u Podgoricu koja se tad još uvijek zvala Titograd. 1990. godine sam postao i savjetnik u crnogorskoj vladi, upoznao se sa profesorom Željkom Bogetićem i zajedno sa njim sam napisao jednu knjigu o valutama.
So just to give you an idea of how complicated it was, and you couldn't fly into Podgorica in those days. So we go to Frankfurt and then go from Frankfurt to Zagreb and go from Zagreb to Dubrovnik, and somebody from usually 3 cars would come to pick. It was dangerous because Milošević had an X on my back. And so the cars would come from Podgorica and pick us up in Dubrovnik, and we drive down to Podgorica, and that's how we got there. So even the logistics were hard to imagine now. That was only 20 years ago, but that's the way it worked.
Dakle, prije samo 20 godina stvari su bile izuzetno komplikovane i teške na ovom prostoru. Bilo je jako teško, recimo, doći uopšte do Podgorice. Morali smo da letimo do Dubrovnika, onda bi nas tu kupili automobilima iz Podgorice i za mene je lično tad bilo opasno da budem na tom prostoru, jer postojala je prijetnja od strane Slobodana Miloševića koji me je uzeo na zub, da tako kažem. Tako da je i logistički sve bilo veoma teško organizovati.
So now I'll summarize and then stop the little introduction. In December of 1999, Đukanović made a decisive move, a very daring and actually quite dangerous move, but smart, very smart move, and that is to make the Deutsche Mark legal tender. And we'd arranged with the Bundesbank to send some extra money down to Montenegro to facilitate this, and it all happened, and that was the start down the road towards the independence of Montenegro. Montenegro, if Đukanović had not done that, I do not think Montenegro would exist as a separate republic today. It was. The currency reform was the big thing, and it was very big.
Dakle, u decembru 1999. Milo Đukanović je donio sudbonosnu odluku koja je bila opasna, ali isto tako i veoma pametna, da se u Crnu Goru uvede njemačka marka kao zvanična valuta. Kontaktirali smo Njemačku centralnu banku koja nam je obezbijedila izvjesnu količinu novca i ta odluka je bila sudbonosna i ja mislim da bez te odluke Crna Gora danas ne bi postojala kao nezavisna država.
And to just again to put it in the context, in those days, there was a small delegation from Montenegro, including Đukanović, that came to the United States, came to Washington, and of course they couldn't even arrange a meeting with the main big senators in the United States, the important ones. I happen to know the important ones. I arranged the meeting myself. And that's the way it was happening. I mean, it was not it was not done as normally you would do things. I happen to know personally some of the important senators. I called them and asked if they'd meet with Đukanović, and the delegation they did agree to do it. But the leading one at the time was a very important senator, Richard Lugar, from the state of Indiana. He was a main foreign policy senator and very influential. So we met, and that was the introduction of Đukanović to the American heavyweight politicians. But that's the way it was done.
Dakle, u to vrijeme je jedna mala crnogorska delegacija u kojoj je bio i Đukanović došla u Ameriku. Oni nisu mogli čak ni da zakažu sastanak, nisu znali kako, sa nekim važnijim političkim figurama u Americi. Ja sam poznavao neke ljude, neke glavne igrače, preko mene su uspjeli da se sastanu sa senatorom Richardom Lugerom iz Indijane, koji je u to vrijeme bio jedna od velikih političkih figura što se tiče zakonodavstva. Dakle, ništa u to vrijeme nije bilo rađeno nekim formalnim kanalima.
So even though things were formally done in the sense that, for example, the book that laid out the blueprint for currency reform in Montenegro that Bogatic and I wrote, it's a scholarly book. It's a very high quality book, but the book is one thing, and the quality is one thing, and the scholarship. In reality, the way things were happening is what we'd say they were happening by the seat of our pants. It was very chaotic. And the same thing, by the way, I wrote a book with Kurt Schuler that was published in Belgrade at the Economics Institute in 1990. And that book was the reason why the Dayton Peace Agreement contains an article that mandates a currency board for the first 6 years of Bosnia-Herzegovina. That is in the Dayton Agreement. And why is it in the Dayton Agreement? It's because I wrote a book, the first book in Serbo-Croatian, by the way, that was available, and the Serbs actually agreed to that. Milosevic actually agreed to that provision in the Dayton Agreement, Article 6 of the Dayton Agreement.
Excuse me.
And the reason was the book was published in a high quality form in Serbo-Croatian in Belgrade in 1990. And the same you see goes for the book Bogatic and I did. So the scholarship thing does actually play a role. It was a foundation in these things, these reforms that were done, but the actual implementation and so forth was very chaotic and as I say, by the seat of our pants.
Dakle, ova knjiga koju sam ja napisao sa profesorom Bogetićem, to je jedna veoma kvalitetna akademska knjiga. Međutim, ono što je rađeno u praksi, rađeno je uz velike napore i nije bilo ni malo lako. Na primjer, ja sam napisao isto tako sa profesorom Kurtom Schulerom jednu knjigu koja je izdata, to je bilo veoma kvalitetno izdanje na srpsko-hrvatskom jeziku i zahvaljujući toj knjizi i onome što smo nas dvojica u njoj napisali, Dejtonski sporazum, odnosno njegov član 6, sadrži jednu odredbu da se recimo mora osnovati valutni odbor u prvih 6 godina postojanja Bosne i Hercegovine. Dakle, akademska zajednica itekako ima ulogu u svim ovim procesima, ali opet kažem, ono što se dešavalo u praksi je bilo dosta haotično.
Thank you. Dr. Hanke, before you kind of move to 1999, I would like to move you a little back because we were having similar kind of webinar, and I came across a letter or an essay of Professor, you may know him, Professor Vukotic from Montenegro, in which he claims that in these kind of decisive points of introduction of euro, actually you and Professor Bogatic were more kind of pushing for currency board. And actually that was Professor Vukotic pushing for dollarization idea in Montenegro. I don't want to get in anything personal, but would you, through this, while answering this question, actually evaluate a little bit for us these kind of possible choices between dollarization and currency boards for Montenegro, because they're kind of similar, but they are very different, yeah?
Okay, so the book that Bogatic and I wrote is focused on currency boards. Once I became a state counselor, and so we wrote the book, then I became a state counselor and started advising Đukanović, and it became clear as we move forward to making a choice that a currency board would have been too complicated to set up, and the easiest mechanism to do this would be dollarization. The debate about who did what is essentially irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference. The main player in the thing, quite frankly, was me. Đukanović would have never even met any U.S. politicians if it hadn't been me.
Excuse me, if I could just translate. Dakle, knjiga koju smo napisali profesor Bogetić i ja fokusirala se na valutne odbore. Prvo smo napisali knjigu, a zatim se ja postao savjetnik predsjednika Đukanovića i onda dok smo raspravljali o svemu tome, shvatili smo da bi formiranje valutnog odbora bilo previše komplikovano, a da bi mnogo jednostavniji put bila dolarizacija. Sad rasprave o tome ko je šta uradio u to vrijeme nisu toliko bitne. Ono što je važno je da sam u suštini ja tu bio glavni igrač i da Đukanović ne bi uspio ni da se upozna sa nekim bitnim američkim političarima da nije bilo mene.
So, and ultimately, the reason for using the Deutschmark as legal tender, rather than setting up a currency board, was speed. It was easier and it could be done more rapidly. And the environment was very dangerous at the time because Milošević had the tanks at the border. I mean, he was ready to invade Montenegro with the federal troops from Yugoslavia. So that was the main thing. As far as the details, I was very involved in those, including making contact with the Deutsche Bank to essentially have them approve this move of making the Deutschmark legal tender in Montenegro. So are these different currency boards or dollarization, Deutschmarkization? That's going to be the question I answer next.
Dakle, odlučili smo se da uvedemo njemačku marku kao legalnu zvaničnu valutu u Crnu Goru, zato što, kao što sam rekao, osnivanje ovih valutnih odbora bilo bi previše komplikovano, a sa druge strane situacija u Crnoj Gori je u to vrijeme bila veoma opasna. Milošević je imao trupe na samoj granici sa Crnom Gorom i bio je spreman da uđe u Crnu Goru. Ja sam ostvario kontakte recimo sa njemačkom bankom da ugovorimo uvođenje njemačke marke u Crnu Goru.
So, I am an advocate of both dollarization and currency boards. Now, mechanically, they're exactly the same. Economically, they're exactly the same. And they're exactly the same because in a country that has either a foreign currency that's dollarized and no domestic currency, or they have a currency board, they have an exchange rate policy, but they don't have any monetary policy. The country doesn't. Now, let me explain that.
Could I just translate that because that's kind of, dakle, ja sam uvijek bio zagovarač i dolarizacije i ovih valutnih odbora. Ekonomski i mehanički ovi sistemi funkcionišu na isti način. Sada ću ovo malo podrobnije da objasnim.
So let's start with a currency board. So the currency board requires you to do the following things. You issue a domestic currency. That domestic currency is backed 100% by foreign exchange reserves in the anchor currency, and that domestic currency trades and is freely convertible into the anchor currency at an absolutely fixed exchange rate. So with that, the domestic currency becomes a clone of the anchor. It's exactly the same thing as the anchor. It's equivalent because if you don't like the domestic currency produced by the currency board, you can freely exchange it for the anchor it's very credible because they're 100% reserve, so you always can get anchor currency for domestic currency at the fixed rate. So the domestic currency is the same thing as the anchor.
Dakle, kada imate ovaj valutni odbor, možete da uradite sljedeću stvar. Da izdate, da ustanovite domaću valutu, međutim koja je 100% podržana stranom valutom, odnosno razmjenom te strane valute. Možete u bilo kom momentu da, ukoliko vam se ne dopada ta domaća valuta koju ustanovljuje ovaj valutni odbor, da se odlučite da uzmete tu stranu valutu, jer su one potpuno jednake.
To interpret your flow, I'm not interpreting much, but you had one interesting point, and we have a lot of questions from the people in the stream. And one of the questions, and it's kind of enigmatic and still unresolved among public, even academics in Montenegro, is the question by Milenko Popović, professor at University of Mediterranean. He asked the question, did German central bank just help you to exchange Montenegrin dinars for Deutschmark, or simply gave money for free to us? There is a lot of speculations in country even today. It's not clear, was this kind of a loan, free loan, or it was just exchange of the other currencies that we had, dollars or gold for Deutschmarks?
The precise answer to that I can't give because I never did an audit of the thing. I don't know exactly. I don't know. I know that they sent I believe one armored truck with small coins and small bills. So it was just to facilitate liquidity in Deutschmarks. There were a lot of Deutschmarks in Montenegro, though. The whole place was the Deutschmark. You couldn't buy a car if you didn't have Deutschmarks. You couldn't buy a house unless you had Deutschmarks. But I think the facilitation of the making of the legal tender status was facilitated with some smaller bills and coins that the Bundesbank supplied. But whether these were a gift or an exchange, or I have no idea. They could have even been exchanged for Deutschmark bills for small change. I don't know.
Dakle, ne znam tačno kako je fizički odrađeno uvođenje njemačke marke u Crnu Goru, o kakvoj se tu razmjeni radilo, da li je Crna Gora dobila prosto taj novac za džabe ili u razmjenu za zlato ili u zamjenu za crnogorske dinare. Znam samo da je iz Njemačke bilo poslato jedno blindirano vozilo koje je prevozilo metalne i male papirne apoene, a u svakom slučaju u to vrijeme u Crnoj Gori već bilo dosta njemačkih maraka u opticaju. Niste mogli da obavite nikakvu veću kupovinu ako niste imali njemačke marke.
In a way, you see, your question's interesting because in a way, all of the former Yugoslavia, including Montenegro, it had already spontaneously adopted the Deutschmark. So the real value of the Yugoslav dinar was nothing. It was irrelevant, basically.
Dakle, vaše pitanje je zanimljivo još iz jednog razloga. U suštini, na čitavom prostoru Jugoslavije njemačka marka je neformalno već bila praktično u opticaju. U to vrijeme dinar nije vrijedio ništa.
See, now this gets to the point that I raised about how the evolution, the first idea was, by the way, Bogatic and I primarily favoring and writing a book about currency boards. Both Bogatic and I are big dollarizers, so that's a non-issue. I was involved with the dollarization of Montenegro. In the year 2000, I was the economic advisor in Ecuador, in which we dollarized Ecuador in 2000. So this debate about whether I was for a currency board or a dollarization is irrelevant. I was for both. Initially, currency boards, it evolved into dollarization because it was easy to do. All you had to do is officially say what was actually spontaneously a reality in Montenegro. Montenegro had already spontaneously, unofficially dollarized. So all Đukanović did was sign something saying it's legal now, it's official. And it was done.
Yeah.
Dakle, i profesor Bogetić i ja smo veliki zagovarači dolarizacije. Sad raspravljati o tome da li sam ja bio za valutne odbore ili za dolarizaciju, to je besmisleno jer sam bio u suštini za oboje. Dolarizacija se u Crnoj Gori desila spontano u praksi i Đukanović je samo to formalizovao.
What happened?
Yeah, probably he just have a drink or something like this. While we're waiting for Professor Hanke, is Professor Shahmurov having any remark, because he was quite involved in the Eastern Europe privatization almost from every country. He actually started the Jeffrey Sachs privatization of Ukraine, Poland. It was one of the first experts that Harvard team actually sent in the former Soviet Union. I think I mean, I don't have to think, he was the first economist that joined Leonid Kuchma and his government. Dr. Hanke, can I just ask you, respect one? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me follow up just with a couple of things, because this is actually important, this line of questioning. Now, so it's easy to officially dollarize a country if it's already unofficially dollarized.
Yeah, I can testify. I can testify because everyone in Montenegro was actually doing transactions in Deutschmarks. Like it's like Gresham's law. The bad money drives good money out. In essence, maybe it's a kind of inversion in Montenegro, but everyone was doing transactions in Deutschmarks, and everyone was doing savings in Deutschmarks. So Montenegro was probably 80% dollarized before it was officially dollarized. Yeah. So Deutschmarks.
Exactly. Now let me go through the one thing that a currency board has that the dollarized system does not have. There's only one. There are actually two differences. One difference is that you have bills and coins that are in the domestic currency with a currency board. You don't have the Deutschmark or the euro. You have a Montenegrin marca, or whatever you want to call it. So that would have been a problem, because we would have had to have those bills printed someplace. It would have taken time. And time would have been a problem. Milosevic would have known about this, and Milosevic would have caused a lot of problems if he would have known in advance that we were going to issue new notes and coins, and those would replace the Yugoslav dinar. So one thing that's different with the currency board, you have local money circulating. The second thing.
Excuse me, could I just translate the first part of what you said? Dakle, koja je razlika između dolarizacije i valutnog odbora? Ako imate valutni odbor, onda biste imali recimo odštampanu domaću valutu. Sad problem sa tim je upravo to štampanje. Moraju se negdje odštampati te banknote. U to vrijeme u Crnoj Gori bi to bio veliki problem, odnosno Milošević bi napravio Crnoj Gori problem ako bi saznao unaprijed da mi planiramo da štampamo novac. To je prva stvar.
Okay, now the second thing is actually quite relevant, and it has nothing to do with taking time to install a currency board versus dollarization, and that is that a currency board makes a profit. There's seniorage because they're issuing a liability, the domestic money that doesn't pay any interest, and that domestic money is backed 100% with anchor currency reserves, and those reserves earn interest. The spread between zero interest on the money being issued and the positive interest rate you're receiving in reserves, that's a profit. And that is really the only difference in a currency board from a financial point of view. The currency board makes a profit, dollarization does not.
Dakle, druga razlika bi bila ta što kad imate ovu direktnu dolarizaciju, onda ovaj valutni otpor ne može da ostvari nikakav profit. A ako bi se štampala domaća valuta, onda bi u suštini valutni odbor ostvarivao profit zahvaljujući tome što je ta domaća valuta podržana realnom nekom stranom, sidrišnom valutom.
May I just like our people on the stream, I have a question from Aleksandar Vucinic, and it's an interesting one. It says like this: Montenegro is a huge trade balance. Do you believe strong euro, the anchor, which is a euro, is partially is it correct to attribute it partially to the adoption of strong currency euro results in lower competitiveness of Montenegro goods and services in international markets and limited potential to boost the exports?
No.
Is euro currency to euroize? Was Deutschmark better?
No. The trade balance and the current account balance have essentially nothing to do with the currency and the exchange rate. They're due to the relationship between domestic savings and investment. And the reason you have a deficit is that you have a deficit in domestic savings relative to domestic investment. So the trade balance has the overall trade balance has nothing to do with the exchange rate, period. End of story. This is just an accounting identity in economics that most economists don't even know. The United States has had a trade deficit every single year since 1975. And the reason that trade deficit exists and the reason that its magnitude is where it is, it's exactly equal to the difference between domestic savings and investment. Our trade deficit in the United States, same in Montenegro. So the exchange rate has nothing to do with it. Now, let me give you an example.
Excuse me, could I just translate that shortly? Dakle, bilo je pitanje da li je možda razlog za to što Crna Gora sad ima ovaj trgovinski deficit i smanjenu konkurentnost na nekom međunarodnom tržištu, taj što je uvela i jaku valutu kao što je euro. Profesor Hanke kaže da to nema nikakve veze, da u stvari taj trgovinski balans zavisi od domaće štednje i investicija. Rekao je da Amerika ima trgovinski deficit od 1975. godine još.
Now, let me give a couple of examples that allow you to get the intuition of the thing. The strongest currency in the world, and the only one that's appreciated in real terms on average since 1913, actually since 1917, is the Swiss franc, Switzerland. Now, that's the strongest currency in the world, the Swiss franc. It's unambiguous. Switzerland always runs a big trade and current account surplus. And they have the strongest currency in the world. Now, you ask the question, well, why? And they do that because they save a tremendous amount relative to the investment that they're making. Savings exceeds investment in Switzerland, and as a result, they always have a surplus. Exactly the same thing with Germany. Germany always runs a big surplus on their trade account, and the reason they do that is that they have a big surplus of savings.
Dakle, da objasnim jednu stvar. Trenutno najjača valuta u svijetu je švajcarski franak. Švajcarci uvijek imaju veliki trgovinski suficit, prosto zbog toga što im štednja prevazilazi vrijednost investicija. I isti je slučaj sa Njemačkom.
See, are you finished?
Yeah.
I'm looking up the numbers right now, and I don't have them quite at my fingertips, but I think consumption, savings is very small in Montenegro. Consumption's very high. I think consumption's about 80% of GDP, or maybe even more than 80%. So if you're worried about trade imbalance, the current account imbalance in Montenegro, the best way to solve that problem is to institute policies that encourage people to save more and start reducing the savings deficiency in Montenegro, and then that imbalance would go away if you thought that was important. I mean,
yeah,
that's how to do it. That's how to do it.
Yeah, but just a remark, people can save out of disposable income, yeah? That's income after taxes, but disposable income of the average person in Montenegro is 500 euros, and this kind of savings
Miloš,
is kind of depleted. I may be wrong, but...
Miloš, this is just an account. If you tell me that oh, this trade deficit is a big problem, we have to have a trade balance, I can fix that in 1 year, and all I would do, I'd have a massive increase in taxes. That would create a huge surplus in the budget of Montenegro, and the savings deficiency would be wiped out. You'd be saving a lot more. Of course, it would kill the economy. It would be a stupid thing to do, but that's how you do it. It's just an accounting thing.
Yep.
Could I just try to give a summary of what you said? Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da je problem u Crnoj Gori i to razlog zašto Crna Gora ima ovaj trgovinski deficit, to što je štednja mala u Crnoj Gori, a potrošnja je velika. I javna potrošnja iznosi sad negdje 80% GDP-a. Kaže da ukoliko bi smo htjeli da riješimo problem ovog trgovinskog deficita, on kaže da bi to bio u stanju da uradi za godinu dana, tako što bi jako digao poreze u Crnoj Gori i na taj način stvorio suficit u budžetu. Međutim, kaže da bi to bila jedna glupa politika jer bi uništila ekonomiju u potpunosti.
Now, Miloš, let me switch into, let me ask myself a question, okay? Okay, because the economist, this is the most interesting part of actually, let us all agree, dollarization and currency boards are exactly the same thing, except with a currency board you have a local money. The local money is a clone of the anchor, and with a currency board you make a profit, and you don't make one when you're dollarized. So what's the important thing? Why have I been a big advocate of currency boards and dollarization? And in fact, every currency board that's been installed since 1983, when Hong Kong was installed. Hong Kong is the biggest currency board. John Greenwood, my friend, who's actually a fellow at the Johns Hopkins University, he installed that in 1983 in Hong Kong. With Miloš, you obviously know that, you were a resident in Hong Kong. Yeah. That's 1983. Every currency board that's been done since 1983, I have done it. I've been the architect, the official advisor, and so forth. We have two big cases of dollarization that I mentioned that I was involved in. One is Montenegro, the other is Ecuador. The third country that's dollarized was in 2002, El Salvador in South America. So I've been very involved with these things and thinking about them. And why are they so important? They're so important because they put a hard budget constraint in the system. They're important not because of monetary economics. That is not the important aspect. The important aspect is that they put a hard budget constraint in the system. Now, what is that? That means that the fiscal authorities cannot borrow money and receive credit from a monetary authority. That's all it means. That's the hard budget constraint. So right now in Montenegro, there is not a central bank. The fiscal authorities can't go to the central bank and borrow money, get credit. So that puts a hard budget constraint in the system. And usually, normally, what this does is the hard budget constraint makes the fiscal authorities, it disciplines them so they more or less balance the budget. And if you look at some place like Bulgaria, where in 1997, I put in a currency board, it works perfectly. You have the conservatives come, you have the socialists come, you have the king come back. They all balance the budget. Now, the fiscal budget is pretty much balanced, always has been balanced in Bulgaria. They have one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in all of Europe. It's 20.4%. 20.4%. It will peak out in 2022 at 28.2%. And by 2024, it will drop down to 24% again in Bulgaria.
Yeah.
So the question is, it works. It always works every place. But what about Montenegro? Montenegro has, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, the debt to GDP is already over 80% of GDP. It's very high. It's, of course, over the Maastricht criteria. You need to have a super hard budget constraint in the system. You need to change the constitution in Montenegro.
Okay, could I just give a very short summary?
Yeah.
Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da je on učestvovao u svakoj dolarizaciji koja je rađena u svijetu od 1983. godine, odnosno u svakom stvaranju ovih valutnih odbora. On kaže da su valutni odbori i dolarizacija u suštini isto. Rekao je da je spomenuo ova tri glavna slučaja gdje je učestvovao u stvaranju tih valutnih odbora, odnosno u dolarizaciji, u Crnoj Gori, Ekvadoru i El Salvadoru. Kaže da je najbitnija stvar u vezi sa dolarizacijom to što nameće stroga budžetska ograničenja u sistemu, odnosno sprečava finansijske institucije u jednoj zemlji da pozajmljuju novac od međunarodnih finansijskih institucija i naveo je Bugarsku kao jedan pozitivan primjer stavljanja javnog duga pod kontrolu. Napomenuo je da je trenutno u Crnoj Gori javni dug veoma visok, čak 80% bruto društvenog proizvoda.
Dr. Hanke, let me interrupt you because you mentioned this kind of massive savings in Montenegro. I remember in my macro books, we were talking about crowding out effect. Is the government is probably one of the main borrowers even in this commercial system. Is this a healthy sign or not a healthy sign? You mentioned fiscal responsibility because even this small saving that is kind of marketed out, I guess the government is the largest buyer of these even commercial loans from these commercial banks. And the fiscal deficits are still not kind of shown out, but I think they are 25% of the budget. So 25% of the budget is not covered.
Okay, so you're putting your finger on the problem here. This is important. What you just said is very important. It's bad, by the way. It does. The crowding out effect does take place. But what? Let's use what you said, Milos, as kind of a little preface to what I'm saying has to be done to correct the situation. And before I do that, remember, almost always the hard budget constraint comes with a currency board or it comes with dollarization. But not always. There are exceptions. I said in 2000, we dollarized Ecuador. Ecuador is in default right now. It's one of the 4 countries in the world that's defaulted. Yeah. It had a socialist president. He kept the dollarization because dollarization is very popular in Ecuador. So he kept that, but he was borrowing money, all kinds of stupid government projects. And now they've defaulted on their loans. So the hard budget constraint didn't work perfectly there. Also, if you look at Bosnia has a currency board, but it has a lot of debt. It's The hard budget constraint isn't that hard. It isn't that binding in Bosnia-Herzegovina. You look at Montenegro, they're in the same situation. A lot of debt, the hard budget constraint isn't working that well. Also, El Salvador, I said in 2002, they dollarized, and they have a lot of debt. So the hard budget constraint doesn't work all the time. So how do we fix the problem? Let's let the translator translate, and then I'll get to how to fix.
Yeah, thanks. Dakle, profesor Hanke je objasnio da su ova ograničenja budžetska koja dolarizacija uvodi u sistem, da je to jedna važna mjera fiskalnog disciplinovanja, ali da ne funkcioniše uvijek na način na koji je to zamišljeno. Naveo je primjer Ekvadora, El Salvadora kao zemalja koje su u ogromnim dugovima. Crna Gora također ima veliki dug. Sad, kako to da popravimo?
So to fix the problem, you need a currency board or dollarization so that you have no monetary authority, no discretionary monetary policy. Discretionary monetary policies in emerging market countries are very dangerous, very bad. They're usually pro-cyclical. They create all kinds of problems, banking crises, currency crises, you name it. It's this bad. So you're better to have a currency board or dollarization. You will have a smaller deficit. You'll have a smaller debt to GDP generally, and you'll have faster growth and lower inflation. So that's fine. That's fine. But how do you fix the problem of Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, El Salvador, Ecuador, where in fact the government goes out, even with a hard budget constraint in Montenegro, you still can't control the politicians. You still can't control the thing. So you have to have a fiscal rule. And the fiscal rule has to go in the Constitution. And the fiscal rule is fairly easy because you have a simple little equation. Outlays minus receipts equal a deficit. Okay, that's a simple little accounting equation. If you control two of the variables, you control obviously the third variable. So the rule is the following, the fiscal rule.
I just translate what you said before the rule. Dakle, umjesto ovih valutnih odbora ili dolarizacije možete da imate svoje diskrecione monetarne politike, ali one su opasne i mogu da izazovu raznorazne krize. Šta je potrebno uraditi da bismo političare stavili pod kontrolu, da prestanu da se zadužuju pored ovih budžetskih ograničenja? Dakle, potrebno je ubaciti jedno vrlo prosto pravilo u sam ustav, izmeniti ustav.
So you have two rules that go in, and the parliament would have to vote a supermajority to do the following things. If you increase the deficit, that means if you increase the debt, you have to have a supermajority that approves it. That's rule one. Rule two.
Prvo pravilo je, ako imate povećani deficit, morate da imate ovu apsolutnu većinu koja će da ga odobri. To je jedno pravilo.
Rule two is that any tax increase, whether it's increasing the rate or the base of an old tax or introducing a new tax, has to be approved by a supermajority. That means 2/3 of the parliament.
Isto tako, bilo kakvo povećanje poreza mora da bude odobreno dvotrećinskom većinom u parlamentu.
So you have control over the deficit with a supermajority vote. You have control over receipts with a supermajority rule. That's the taxes. And that means you control the outlays, which is the third variable. So that's the thing you need in Montenegro. Montenegro has behaved irresponsibly unfortunately, in my view, they have been advised poorly and made poor decisions, or they have way too much debt. And to control that, you have to have Euroization. Okay, good. That's part of a hard budget constraint, but you have to tighten it up with these two fiscal rules that I just gave you.
Dakle, kada imate ova dva pravila, onda stavljate situaciju pod kontrolu. Po mom mišljenju, Crna Gora se ponašala prilično neodgovorno u ovom smislu. Dakle, mora se uraditi ova euroizacija, kako je on to nazvao.
Dr. Hanke, I have a question, and you mentioned it, actually you started it. It's a kind of little bit controversial in Montenegro because Montenegro is a very traditional society and they want to have institutions and leaders of institutions. But would you agree that in dollarization, we don't have central bank, that actually the central bank is just some kind of regulatory body for functioning of the commercial banks, but these prime kind of roles of the central banks do not exist. And it's it's not really a central bank. And if we observe like a reaction to COVID, at least in some countries, the central banker is the prime person that is managing together with the government this shock. And we don't have our central banker didn't have any interview, or actually he does not instill any confidence or anything, because I guess institution is not the central bank. Yeah. Am I correct or I'm wrong?
It isn't a central. It is a central bank. It's because that's the name of it. It is a central bank, but it has no discretionary monetary policy capacity, which is good, not bad. It's good. That's good.
I have a question. I have a question. Can I intervene for a minute?
Yeah.
Because I sent into the chat, with all due respect to dollarization, is it not a solution only in the short run until trust in the government increased? Otherwise, why, look at Poland experience, for example, where they didn't adopt the euro and they did very well. And dollarization really means that we trust the American or whatever the authorities we want to associate with. So let's talk about not the United States, which of course increased the money supply dramatically, rightly so, not rightly so, that's another question. If you look at the Swiss government deciding to appreciate their currency by 30% and killing, a lot of enterprises in Poland. So the question is really, do you really believe that this is a solution in the long run? I understand the short run when we don't trust government and so on, but whom should you trust,
Yeah, it's definitely a solution. I've looked at all the countries that have either dollarized, or 33 that are actually dollarized. And I think I'm not certain about my number on this. It's around 15, I think it's 15 countries have currency boards. They all, the long run, they grow faster. The fiscal deficits are smaller. The debt to GDP is smaller. Inflation's lower. The performance is just superior. It's unambiguous. You do, in general and on average, you do much better with a dollarized or currency board system than you do with an independent central bank. And all you have to do, if you look at so that's a general statement, and I've written, there's a long article I wrote in the Annals that contains the data on that. But also we've done event studies where you had a currency board. Most of Africa, by the way, had currency boards in the old colonial systems. So if you do an event study and you take the time period when the currency board existed, and then the event is the introduction of a central bank, things go south. They get much worse and deteriorate. So you can look at it cross-sectionally or in a time series way. And with the time series, it's very clear. currency boards, the performance is good. Then you put in a central bank and the performance becomes basically deteriorates and in many cases becomes disastrous. So they're just no examples of emerging market countries doing well with independent central banks.
I have a question for.
By the way, you mentioned Poland, and Poland has done fairly well, but Poland, remember, Poland did the big bang. They did all kinds of structural reforms. I think they would have done better with a currency board than they've done, but they've done well. And the big reason for that is that they did lots of structural reforms. Someplace like Montenegro, the big problem in Montenegro, they've never done any structural reforms. They're still fooling around with structural reforms. They're, you know, Montenegro did one thing right, and it was almost done for another reason. It was done because Đukanović wanted independence. He wanted to get away from Yugoslavia, from the rump Yugoslavia, which I think was a smart move. And he knew that the best way to do that would be to make the legal tender of Montenegro the Deutschmark. That was the first step. And then of course they had the referendum and on and on.
Yeah.
But without the original move, it would have never happened.
Yeah.
Could I just try and give a short summary of all of this?
Yeah.
I'll give my best shot. Dakle, trenutno se vodila jedna debata oko toga šta je bolje, imati centralnu banku ili imati ove valutne odbore. Profesor Johanah je pitao profesora Hankea u vezi sa tim, rekao je da je možda dolarizacija dobro kratkoročno rješenje, naveo je neke primjer za to kad dolarizacija nije bila naročito uspješna, međutim profesor Hanke je na to odgovorio da se recimo po njegovom iskustvu u svim državama gdje su postojali valutni odbori to pokazalo kao mnogo bolji sistem nego imati centralnu banku i kaže ako istorijski pratite dešavanja u zemljama koje su imale te valutne odbore, čim se uvede centralna banka kao ustanova, stvari odmah kreću nagore. Onda rekao je da je u Crnoj Gori problem što Crna Gora još uvijek nije odradila nikakve konkretne strukturne reforme.
May I respond to this and say, no one is against structural reforms, of course, but the point is, if you talk about Africa, after all, we all agree that they should run a deficit because they need to invest. They need to borrow money from outside and improve their situation. So I'm not sure that this currency board or dollarization really helps them.
Oh, it helps tremendously because you have stability and reducing exchange rate volatility and the risk associated with it, and the interest rates are much lower.
Yeah.
So
in any case, they need to borrow, in foreign currency. But still, if they can,
no, but they don't. They're not borrowing in foreign currency because if you have a currency board, your domestic money is a clone of the whatever.
No, but I'm saying under free markets, like what Israel did, they had a very high inflation, and then they decided eventually we are going to reduce the money supply and we are going to behave like normal countries. Why should we or any African country will relate to the monetary policy of the United States, which is not great, or the monetary policy of anything else? Yes, we have the good experience of the European Central Bank, but other examples are not very good. The inflation in the United States is, who knows?
Well, what you're arguing, it doesn't really make empirically it isn't valid because the performance of all other central banks, besides the number one, the dollar is the international currency. That's what you want to be in. Forget in a way, forget the euro. It's a big regional currency. It's important, but there are only 4 or 5 currencies that are of any importance in the world whatsoever. But the dollar is the king. Everything is, all trade, 23% of all trade transactions in the world take place in the dollar. So, so far, the Federal Reserve, the relative performance is good. So you would have to make an argument that for some underdeveloped country or developing country, emerging market country, that the policies would be superior if you had an independent central bank. As far as Israel, by the way, I was you know Yaakov Plessner? You must know Plessner. So Plessner
Yes.
was married. Plessner was one of Mary Dorr's advisors, and I was via Plessner. I was advising Mary Dorr, and actually wrote a book that was published in both in Hebrew and English. Obviously, I wrote it in English, not Hebrew, because I don't know Hebrew. And we at that time, when Mary Dorr was the finance minister, I was pushing very hard for a currency board in Israel. And I think it would have been a good thing in Israel.
Would you summarize quickly? Or?
No, we got off on in the weeds about Israel, and they ultimately have settled things down. But the monetary history of Israel with a independent central bank is not that good. It's pretty bad, actually.
Dakle, u suštini vodi se rasprava između profesora Henkea i profesora Johanaha oko toga šta je bolje, da zemlja ima centralnu banku ili da ima valutni odbor. Profesor Hanke očigledno zastupa ovu teoriju da je valutni odbor mnogo bolja opcija. Isto tako rekao je da je dolar u stvari glavna međunarodna valuta, da je euro jeste važan regionalno, ali da je dolar ta valuta u kom se odvija najveći procenat svjetske trgovine. Profesor Johanah je rekao da recimo centralna banka u Izraelu dobro funkcioniše. Profesor Hanke je rekao da uglavnom dobro funkcioniše. To bi otprilike bio neki smisao dosadašnje rasprave.
Thank you. I just want to honor our followers on YouTube and Facebook. There is a question from Jovana. She's asking you, are you following closely economy of Montenegro? And if so, are you happy with kind of your child? Because you invested a lot in this reform. And now, I guess, are you happy with the economic parameters of Montenegro? Thank you, Jovana, for a question.
Well, okay. So I'll try to be shorter and more brief so we have maximum questions going forward. But I am happy, and I'll tell you why. Montenegro would not exist today if it wasn't for the dollarization or Deutschmarkization reform. You wouldn't even be an independent country. You'd be part of what would be the rump Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro. But so in that sense, I am proud of the fact that I participated in one of the major events in the 20th century history, and that's the establishment again of an independent Montenegro. Now,
excuse me, could I just translate that, please? Dakle, profesor Hanke je dobio pitanje da li je zadovoljan time kako crnogorska ekonomija izgleda danas, pošto je ona u neku ruku njegovo dijete. On je rekao da je ponosan na to što je učestvovao u dolarizaciji u Crnoj Gori, jer, kako on kaže, Crna Gora kao nezavisna država ne bi uopšte ni postojala bez toga.
Now, let me give the disappointing. I do follow Montenegro, not only geopolitically, but the economy too. And I am disappointed that they have never really put their shoulder into structural reforms. They've never really done that, and they've been fiscally very irresponsible. So those are two very bad things, but I'm not responsible for them because they happened after I was a state councilor and part of the government of Montenegro.
Dakle, ja pratim dešavanja u Crnoj Gori sa aspekta geopolitike i ekonomije i postoje dvije stvari zbog kojih sam razočaran, koje mi se ne dopadaju, a to je da Crna Gora nikada nije sprovela konkretne strukturne reforme i isto tako da se fiskalno veoma neodgovorno ponaša, međutim to je nešto za što ja nisam kriv jer se to desilo poslije mog angažmana u Crnoj Gori.
Do you foresee that Montenegro government would need someone who is again going to be invited either by we a team of the World Bank or some kind of US or IMF team to kind of help us still to guide through these uncertainties after the COVID? Because if the country is approaching 100% debt to GDP and if the financial markets close to us, I guess we are going to go again with the armors to German central bank and ask for some liquidity in the markets.
Well,
I mean, that's a pessimist view. I could outline the optimist view, but yeah.
Okay, I will just translate the question quickly. Miloš je pitao profesora da li smatra da će možda u budućnosti Crna Gora morati opet da pozove u pomoć nekoga kao što je on, jer trenutno u ovoj situaciji u kojoj smo približavamo se tome da nam javni dug bude čak 100% bruto državnog proizvoda.
Well, I have very little faith in the IMF and the World Bank. I'm a skeptic. Their record is not good. Most of the countries that they go into end up being recidivists. They come back. The IMF and World Bank go in, the program fails, then the country comes back again for another program, and it goes over and over again. Pakistan has just started its 23rd IMF program. So you have to clean these things up internally. So it has to be, you know, Đukanović has been around forever. So let him fix the mess up himself.
Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da on lično ima vrlo malo povjerenja u Međunarodni monetarni fond i Svjetsku banku, a i malo je i međunarodno povjerenje u te organizacije. Poznati su mnogi slučajevi zemalja koji ulaze u određene programe sa tim institucijama. Ti programi nisu baš pretjerano uspješni. Rekao je da što se tiče Crne Gore, pošto je Milo Đukanović na vlasti čitavu vječnost, kako je on to rekao, onda bi on trebalo i sam da sredi ovaj haos koji je do sad stvorio.
Thank you. I'm just afraid, I was reading your articles on Lebanon and I was actually following very closely the situation in Lebanon. Lebanon defaulted and I guess officials in Montenegro are still, maybe they're wary, but there is always political thing to acknowledge actually what is the position, fiscal position of the country, because it's really kind of a short time from a kind of stability that is, I would say, fake stability to house, because like if the financial markets close to us, what is the solution?
Dakle, pitanje je šta bi bilo rješenje ukoliko se financijska tržišta zatvore za Crnu Goru.
Here's what Đukanović should do. He should propose that they change the constitution to include the two fiscal rules that I enunciated. And with that constitutional change, I think there'd be a great deal more confidence that the government would get their house in order and clean things up. He basically should say that we have Euroized, that has put us in a little bit of a straitjacket, the politicians in Montenegro, but it's not a tight enough straitjacket. We have to put in these two fiscal rules that Professor Hanke has recommended and put us even in a tighter straitjacket. And that would be very popular in Montenegro, by the way. His popularity would increase tremendously because they'd say, oh, Đukanović is going to put himself in a straitjacket and put all these politicians around him in a straitjacket so they're disciplined and they're going to eventually get us out of this debt mountain that we're in right now. It would be popular. It would be just as popular as making the Deutschmark legal in 1999.
Dakle, ono što profesor Hanke predlaže, on kaže sljedeće, da bi prvo trebalo Đukanović da predloži ovu promjenu ustava, kako je predložio profesor Hanke, dakle da se uvedu ova dva stroga finansijska pravila koja bi disciplinovala fiskalni sistem i političare u Crnoj Gori. I on kaže da ako bi to Đukanović uradio, to bi ga učinilo popularnim. To bi bilo jednako popularno kao kada je odlučio da uvede njemačku marku u opticaju u Crnoj Gori, jer bi to javnosti poslalo poruku da je on spreman da disciplinuje svoju vladu i političke strukture i da stabilizuje situaciju u zemlji.
And I happen to think Đukanović is actually the right person for this because he has the capacity to do things big. To fix a situation, you have to have a big shock. And a big shock would be changing the Constitution so it contained these fiscal rules that I talked about, these two fiscal rules. So he made a big decision when they made the Deutschmark legal tender. He's made other big decisions about NATO, for example. He could make a big decision on fiscal because now the problem with Montenegro is fiscal discipline.
Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da on lično smatra da je Đukanović upravo osoba koja treba ovo da uradi, jer smatra da je on političar koji je u stanju da donosi veoma krupne odluke, kao što je bila odluka da se uvede marka, da Crna Gora uđe u NATO. Sad bi bilo vrijeme da on donese i krupnu odluku na fiskalnom planu, jer to je upravo i najveći problem u Crnoj Gori, fiskalna nedisciplina.
Do you think, Professor Hanke, that this kind of clientelistic kind of systems, where a lot of things are depending on this state funding, and actually Đukanović party lives out of the state funds, how he can cut the funds to his friends and to himself? Because all of these businesses, none of them is, this entire ecosystem, it's not coming out of the entrepreneurship or IT technology. It's just like simple redistribution. It's a pizza pie, and they're just like taking a cut. Do you think they're able to kind of shrink the piece of the pie that they receive in order to make country do well? I mean, it's kind of a question.
I mean,
could I just translate the question?
Yeah, please.
Would that be okay? Miloš pita gospodina Hankea šta on misli o tome da li bi Đukanović uopšte mogao i njegova partija, da li bi mogli da prestanu da budu toliko ovisni od državnog budžeta, jer praktično i da vode ovu klijentelističku politiku koju sada vode, jer svi njegovi poslovni partneri i prijatelji u Crnoj Gori, oni u suštini ne žive od svog preduzetništva, već od klasične preraspodjele sredstava iz budžeta.
Well, let me put it this way. I haven't talked to Đukanović for a long time. I wish I could talk to him because I try to talk him into doing just what I told you because otherwise they're sleepwalking into a disaster. It's going to end badly. They can't continue doing what they're doing. Even the current account deficit, everybody complains, oh, the trade deficit, the current account deficit. Well, the reason for that is the accounting identity that I told you about earlier in our session, and that is the fiscal deficit is so big, of course, you're going to have a big current account deficit. By definition, it's an identity. It has to happen. So fixing all of this up and getting credibility in the government again is a very important thing. And I think to do that, the fiscal rules would be important.
Profesor Hanke kaže
so it is possible, but you have to have somebody with the courage to make a big decision. And that's, it's big. It's big. To change it, it's big, but you have to do it.
Profesor Hanke kaže da bi on volio da ima priliku da razgovara sa Đukanovićem, nije dugo sa njim razgovarao i u svakom slučaju pokušao bi da ga nagovori da uradi ovo što je on predložio, jer u Crnoj Gori je upravo najveći problem taj fiskalni deficit i kaže za tu vrstu promjene u svakom slučaju treba neko ko je u stanju da donese krupnu odluku i to je to.
The important, Miloš, the important thing, and what I'm saying is that, in other words, now I'm certain Đukanović has very little credibility in the public. So if he publicly said, we're going to start controlling the fiscal affairs, we're going to start reducing the deficit, the debt, and everything, no one would believe him. Because
I would agree. I would agree.
No one, but they would. They would if he said, we're changing the Constitution and we're requiring supermajority voting on any new taxes or any increase in the public debt. So that's the only, he has to change the rules of the game. He can't keep playing with the same rules that they have now, because no one believes him, and I don't know what the outcome of the October election will be, but I'm not predicting the outcome, but I'm just saying that it's actually not so good. It's not so good.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, before Vlado translates, October it was judged too far for an election, so he called early election in the end of the August. Because and many analysts would say he could not wait for October because the numbers would be really kind of terrible of the first two quarters, and okay, they could not be hidden. So the election is actually on August 30th.
Okay, so I'm behind time.
No. You actually. Thank you very much for this.
Hey, could I just do a short translation? Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da je siguran da je sad nivo Đukanovićevog kredibiliteta u javnosti jako nizak i smatra da ako bi on najavio ovu promjenu pravila igre, odnosno promjenu ustava i za koju bi trebala dvotrećinska većina u parlamentu, on smatra da bi to povećalo njegovu popularnost u javnosti i njegov kredibilitet.
Thank you. I have now questions from the people that are following us. There is a Marco from Kotor Bay. You both must know Johanan and Steve.
Yeah. That's a great. I love that place. That's a great place.
Yeah, and you're welcome to visit us again. But he says, if let's say Montenegro overcomes these issues with the currency board, then that's fine. Is there enough kind of I would say experts to rebuild the economic system beyond these IMF teams or World Bank teams or what is imposed by us? Do we really have enough kind of brain to run this small country in a kind of feasible and optimal way that is far away from bankruptcy? Yeah. I mean, from your point.
Could I translate the question first before you answer? Dakle, pitanje je bilo ukratko da li Crna Gora posjeduje dovoljan broj stručnjaka koji bi pomogli u rekonstrukciji crnogorske ekonomije kad bi se riješili ovi fiskalni problemi.
The answer is it isn't that there aren't good ideas floating around. I mean, if I had a half an hour on the telephone with Đukanović, I'd give him my ideas. And there are other people in Montenegro and so forth that would be giving ideas. The problem is the political culture of Montenegro. It's exactly the same as the old Yugoslav. Nothing has changed. And I know this because I was part of it, so I know how it works. And it's like putting a bunch of cats in a bag and letting them fight with each other.
Profesor Hanke kaže da nedostatak dobrih ideja uopšte nije problem. On bi sam mogao Đukanoviću, kad bi razgovarao s njim na telefon, da da neke dobre ideje. Siguran je da i u Crnoj Gori postoje ljudi sa dobrim idejama. Ono što jeste problem je to što se u Crnoj Gori politička kultura praktično nije promijenila od vremena Jugoslavije. Kaže, svi se ponašaju kao mačke u džaku koje se između sebe tuku i grebu.
So Montenegro is a small place. It should be very, very easy to run very efficiently, like Singapore. I mean, yep. you should be running it like a company, not a country. It's more like it's like a company, and it should be very easy to run. Kuan Yew in 1965 became the first leader of the newly independent Singapore. It was one of the poorest places in the world, almost ready to go into civil war. By the way, when they started, of course, they had some money because they had a currency board. And he had 5 other key principal points that he instituted. And boom, it's one of the richest places in the world. By the way, one of the 6 points that he had was that they would not pass the begging bowl. Now that is a problem in Montenegro because the politicians spend most of their time passing the begging bowl. They want money. They want people to give them money. And if you look at the transfers going to Montenegro, it's a pretty large part of the balance of payments actually. So they're living off foreign aid in part. Singapore, no foreign aid. They never took any foreign aid from anyone.
Profesor Hanke kaže da je Crna Gora jako mala zemlja i da bi je bilo veoma lako efikasno voditi i upravljati njome i kaže da bi Crnom Gorom trebalo u suštini upravljati kao kompanijom. Naveo je primjer Singapura. Prvi singapurski predsjednik ili premijer Kuan Yew je 1965. uveo 6 tačaka koje je njegova vlada pratila. Jedna od tih 6 tačaka, najvažnija po profesoru Hankeu, je bila ta da Singapur neće tražiti stranu pomoć. A u Crnoj Gori vidimo potpuno suprotan slučaj. Crnogorski političari stalno traže stranu pomoć i uzimaju novac sa strane, što je veliki problem.
I have a comment from one of the people on the stream. It's a little bit pessimist, but it tells maybe about the confidence of the citizens of Montenegro in the government. He said, Montenegro is a German colony and our central banks exist only on the papers and for commercial banks. Or it's just like an exchange office with European Central Bank, IMF, World Bank, etc. We don't produce anything anymore. And we import basically everything. Montenegro is slowly dying in front of the eyes of the entire world. And I can say this too, it doesn't matter that the world doesn't care. What really matters is to see that our government doesn't completely care about Montenegro and its citizens. I mean, it's not you may comment, but I guess it confirms that the average people believe that I guess the government is far away. It's not the entity that works in an optimal way like this entity that governs the country. So it's
should I translate this? Hoću prevesti ovo?
Yeah.
Dakle, jedan od pratilaca ovog live streama je komentarisao da je Crna Gora ništa više od njemačke kolonije, da se u Crnoj Gori ništa ne proizvodi, da se sve maltene uvozi, da Crna Gora polako umire pred očima svijeta, ali da nije toliki problem taj što svijet nije briga za Crnu Goru, već je mnogo veći problem što izgleda da crnogorsku vladu nije briga za Crnu Goru i to je jedna slika možda apatije koja vlada trenutno u Crnoj Gori među crnogorskim stanovništvom i njihovog nepovjerenja u vladu.
Well, my only comment here is that given the sentiments that the questioner emitted, it would all be way worse if you actually had an independent central bank. In other words, having the Deutschmark, then the euro, is a good thing. Is a good thing, not a bad thing. In the context of that question or that pessimistic observation. The observation is that you don't trust the politicians. The politicians are doing a bad job. The politicians are far away from everything. They don't care about anything. So it's a good thing not to have Montenegrin politicians with their hands on the monetary levers, and they don't have their hands on the monetary levers because you don't have your own money. That's good.
Profesor Hanke kaže da u ovakvoj situaciji, kad Crna Gora ima takve političare kako ima, dobra je stvar što ona nema, u suštini nema svoju centralnu banku koja je to samo imenom, a ne i praktično, i da je dobro što nema svoju valutu, jer bilo bi jako loše kada bi takvi crnogorski političari odlučivali i o fiskalnoj politici.
Thank you. I have a question from Aleksandar Vučanić, and it's following up your comment on introducing these rules, fiscal rules in constitution. Is there an example of the country having the mentioned fiscal rules embedded in constitution? And could it be a barrier to intervene in extraordinary situation for a government? So it would be kind of check and balance, I assume, but is there any practical example of any country that actually introduced this set of the fiscal rules in its constitution?
Well,
Can I translate the question?
Yes.
Jedan slušalac je postavio pitanje, pitao je profesor da navede možda jedan primjer neke zemlje koja je u svoj ustav uvela izmjene koje je on predložio.
The answer is yes. Now, you're gonna, if you hold my feet to the fire and tell me to list all the countries, I can't do it right off the top of my head. But the answer is yes. In the United States, for example, these are state governments. Most state governments have fiscal rules like this. State governments, not the national government, but state governments. And most of the state governments in the United States are much bigger than European countries. I mean, they're huge economies actually, and certainly way bigger than Montenegro. So almost all the United States, the states have this, and some. Now, if you look, there was a fiscal rule in Europe, by the way. It's called the Maastricht Treaty. And what do the Europeans do? They just break the rules. No one follows the rules. That's Europe. I mean, Europe's a little bit of a joke, actually, quite frankly. From an economic point of view, they make rules, they sign a treaty, and who were the first one? I think France might have even been the first one to break the Maastricht rule. I can't remember. You know, the 3%. The 3% deficit. That's a fiscal rule. A 60% debt to GDP. That's a fiscal rule. It's not exactly the ones that I gave. I think mine are better actually. But so there are lots of places with fiscal rules, and of course the question is whether you're going to follow the rules. In the United States, the states that have them, they follow the rules. They follow the constitutional rules. Europe, it's flexible.
I don't know. You need to take into account the coronavirus, and I think also the United States extended the credit and the printed money.
No, not at the states. The states haven't broken the rules. The federal government has no rule. There are no fiscal rules and no monetary rules, but the state governments, almost all of them have.
Right.
Could I translate the...
Yes,
okay. I'm going to be right back.
Dakle, profesor Hanke je rekao da ne može poimence da navede države u kojima postoji primjer da su uvođenje ovih fiskalnih pravila u ustav, ali recimo kaže da većina saveznih američkih država ima takva pravila u svojim državnim ustavima, dakle ne na federalnom nivou, nego pojedinačne države. S druge strane, kritikovao je Evropu i evropsku uniju, nazvao ih je čak pomalo sprdnjom, zato što su same prekršile sopstvena pravila koja su uvele.
So the question, once he comes back, is how do you fight the coronavirus if you have dollarizations?
Yeah. That would be.
We cannot avoid this question other than talking about,
kind of, this is the question of all questions.
Right. So Montenegro is suffering because of tourism and so on, not because of Montenegro. It's just because of the coronavirus. So.
Exactly, and they allowed the borders to be open with Serbia now, but the latest kind of statistical estimation was that tourism revenue declined by 92%. Dr. Hanke, we were chatting while you kind of left briefly, and we were interested how the corona impacts dollarized countries. Let's say obviously it's going to be a shock, and it's going to be a shock to public finances. Unemployment is dropping in 10%. For Montenegro, tourism revenue is so far the estimate is about 90% down. And is there any kind of explanation how these dollarized countries can
okay, let me make one remark first, because of the virus, and then I'll answer your question, which is also virus related. The fiscal rules that I have written up have one exception, and that is they do not apply when a country is in a state of war. So it's conceivable you could declare the virus, the pandemic, that the country was in a state of war, and the fiscal rules would be temporarily abandoned. So that's one little footnote to the rules. So you would have the state of war provision. Now, back to your question, it's very interesting because the currency board countries, in general, again, there's always a distribution. So you'll be able to find exceptions on both ends of the distribution. But in general, they're doing much better in the coronavirus situation than countries that have independent central banks. And the reason for that is they've had more fiscal discipline. They have less debt. So they have a lot more capacity to expand fiscally and borrow money and spend than they would have had if they had central banks. That's really what's going on. The countries that are burdened with central banks have found their capacity to borrow is evaporated because they have a local currency, a local central bank. With the pandemic, their currency has collapsed. Almost all their borrowing is in dollars, or some of it in euros, but most of it in dollars. So the debt burden automatically has gone up. They haven't made any new loans, but the burden of their debt goes way up because their currency is depreciated against the US dollar. So in general, I would say the currency board countries and dollarized countries have done much better in the pandemic from an economic point of view. And if you look at, for example, Bulgaria, which has a very, very low debt ratio, the Economist has them for 2020, their forecast for a GDP decline of -4%. Now, the comparable one, they have a GDP decline in Montenegro of 7.5%. The government balance, -7.3 in Montenegro and -3 in Bulgaria. The unemployment rate of 17.1% in Montenegro, it's only 8.2 in Bulgaria. That's just one example, but Bulgaria is somewhat similar Montenegro. So the negative shock is big because of the pandemic, but it's not as big as if you would have had a central bank. That's generally.
Dakle, ono što je profesor Hanke rekao je u suštini da on smatra da su države koje imaju valutne odbore umjesto centralne banke u suštini mnogo bolje podnijele krizu koju je izazvala pandemija koronavirusa, upravo zbog toga što države sa centralnim bankama njihove valute su devalvirale zbog ekonomske situacije. Naveo je primjer Bugarske, recimo, koja u mnogim statističkim tačkama stoji bolje od Crne Gore što se tiče postotka nezaposlenosti, što se tiče deficita u budžetu, javnog duga. Kaže da zemlje koje imaju valutne odbore i one jesu pretrpjele udar zbog pandemije koronavirusa, ali ni izbliza toliki kao kad bi imale svoju centralnu banku.
See, you've got to think just in simple terms. The currency board in dollarized countries, they've gone into the pandemic with a margin of safety, a bigger cushion than the other countries. They have much more borrowing capacity.
Dakle, države koje imaju valutne odbore su u krizu ušle sa sposobnošću da više pozajmljuju novac nego one koje imaju centralnu banku. Dakle, imali su jednu marginu, odnosno manevarski prostor.
Now, the exceptions. What are the exceptions? Montenegro, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Those are the exceptions.
Sad, izuzeci od ovog pravila su Crna Gora, Ekvador, El Salvador i Bosna i Hercegovina.
And that's why they need fiscal rules.
I zbog toga im upravo i trebaju ova stroža fiskalna pravila.
Dr. Hanke, would you evaluate these samo tvoj ton na ekranu? We can two of us are now in the same room, so the voice is doubling up.
Sve sam smanjio. Znači, u slušalicama te ne čuje. Mikrofon je isključen.
Ne mikrofon, nego speaker svoj. Ne znam, nekako druga sam. Okay. We apologize. Is it double voice? Yeah. Kad ja ugasim moj speaker, onda ti funkcionišeš normalno.
Da.
A možeš ti ugasiti tvoj speaker?
Evo sad sam ga stavio skroz na minimum.
Ovaj speaker, da. Yeah. Are we hear each other? I want to ask the question about European Central Bank intervention. And this European Central Bank intervention actually spread some money out to the member countries. How much the speed of euro formal adoption by Montenegro would help fiscal position of Montenegro, or at least bring some stability?
I think it's irrelevant. If you formally join the Eurozone, it wouldn't make any difference because nothing would change basically in terms of fiscal transfers. In terms of fiscal transfers, it wouldn't make any difference.
Thank you. There is a question by Mitter about endemic corruption. He believes that Montenegro is actually having endemic corruption, nepotism, and injustice, and actually feeling of injustice in the country by big number of the people inside. Could this actually lead to the real loss of this independence? And then finally, as you were kind of a trader in the currency markets and very successful, can you predict the level of the dollar against euro? in the short term and long term?
Okay,
Two questions.
The culture in Montenegro has existed for probably centuries. So if it changes, it won't change very fast. It's been that way forever.
Kultura takva kakva je u Crnoj Gori, crnogorska kultura, postoji vjekovima i ako se i bude mijenjala, sigurno se neće mijenjati brzo.
It might create practical problems in terms of if Montenegro wants to enter the EU, which it does, and it's opened. What do they have? 33 chapters or something like that. But it might stop that process. The corruption and just criminality in general and illegal people transiting Montenegro going into the Eurozone. Those are all problems that will have some bearing on whether and when Montenegro might get into the European Union. But in general, Montenegro has always been the way it is, so culturally. So that won't change. Now, translate, and then Milos, remind me the last part of your question you asked, because I forgot what it was.
Dakle, profesor Hanke kaže da će recimo problem korupcije i organizovanog kriminala u Crnoj Gori možda čak i u potpunosti zaustaviti proces evropskih integracija, ali kaže da je kultura ovakva kakva je u Crnoj Gori takva već vjekovima.
Milos, you asked the last part of your question. I forgot what it was.
The last part of my question was if you were a successful trader in the currency market. The question was asking like, can you predict in the short and long term the rate or fluctuations between euro and dollars? Because we have some friends who are in Emirates right now, and Emirates are pegged to the US dollar. So their salaries are kind of getting good hit in the last month because dollar lost the value against euro, I guess 10% or something like this.
So I think the fair, let me put it this way. I'm not predicting where it will go, but I think the fair value of the dollar euro exchange rate's between about 120 and 140. So it's about 118 now or something like that. So it's still the dollar's, even though it's depreciated a little bit in the last month and a half, it's still a little bit on the strong side from a fundamental point of view.
Kaže, neću baš da pravim u klasičnom smislu predviđanje odnosa između eura i dolara, ali mislim da je neki realan odnos 1,20 prema 1,40.
Thank you. We have some more questions from our spectators. Dr. Hanke, whenever you feel kind of tired, just give us a sign and say, we spoke a lot about Montenegro and we are ready to retire. Feel free, but as long as you are kind of happy with us, we are here. Dr. Hanke, how do you expect should the state of Montenegro pay its large debts if we already sold for almost 100 years in advance and our companies, land, everything is sold, we produce barely nothing, export, frankly nothing, import is up to 100% of GDP, we are in precise leisure position. And I'm afraid to imagine what would happen if we would stand alone. I'm afraid the government did almost unrepairable damage to our budget. It's a kind of...
Well, the only thing I can say is that you're going to have to eventually... I keep coming back to the fiscal rules. you have to have those fiscal rules, and unless you're going to commit some kind of suicide, you have to start digging out of the hole. You've gotten yourself in a hole, and you've got to dig out of it. And the best way to do that is to dig out yourself.
Dakle, kao što sam već rekao, stalno se vraćam na ova fiskalna pravila. Dakle, morate uvesti ta fiskalna pravila. I ukoliko ne namjeravate da izvršite samoubistvo, morate sami da se iskopate iz te rupe u koju ste se sami zakopali.
There is one more question. Our government is building a highway, and many people call it nowhere from nowhere, because they started this highway from the middle of the country with the goal to support to connect Adriatic Sea with Serbia, but it's there are like three routes, three actually parts of the road, and they're just building one in the middle, and people refer to it road from nowhere to nowhere, but it costs 1/2 of the budget. And Zoran from Polashin is asking, he said, our government is building this highway. The rate for these loans are coming soon. How do we survive, as how the average people would kind of survive these hard times, as GDP debt level is 90% already. So again, I guess it's
this is a classic white elephant. We call them in English anyway, white elephants. I don't know what they call them in Serbo Croatian, but exactly the same thing happened in Ecuador. Ecuador dollarized in 2000. Then they elected basically a communist, just a hardcore socialist president. And the first thing that he did is build a huge new airport for Quito, Ecuador. But the airport is about 70 kilometers from Quito. It's unbelievable. And now Ecuador has defaulted on its debt because they had to borrow so much money to finance the airport and other projects, other white elephants. So if you had fiscal rules, that would solve the problem. That's all I can say. You just need the fiscal rules. Every one of these questions points to the same solution, fiscal rules.
Dakle, profesor Hanke je dobio pitanje od jednog slušalca koji je pitao na koji način će Crna Gora da se izvuče iz ogromnog duga u koji je zapala zato što gradi autoput koji vodi iz ničega u ništa. Profesor Hanke je rekao da nas to ponovo vraća na ovaj problem fiskalnih pravila. Spomenuo je primjer Ekvadora, gdje je ekvadorski predsjednik, socijalista, čim je došao na vlast, odlučio da izgradi ogroman novi aerodrom, koji je međutim 70 km od glavnog grada, što je potpuno apsurdno. Dakle, profesor Hanke ponovo podvlači da je neophodno uvesti ova fiskalna pravila koja on spominje.
Thank you, Dr. Hanke. I guess we are already 2 hours into something, and we'll let you to conclude your kind of webinar here. Would you have any kind of good message for us to kind of?
Well, I've convinced myself in our discussion that a fiscal rule is the main thing. So call Đukanović and tell him to give me a telephone call and we'll discuss it.
Yeah, I guess these days he's very busy, and probably he won't listen to anyone who is not going to deliver him quick election victory. So, but maybe we can.
No, Milos, I told you before, this is an election winner, because can you imagine Đukanović campaigning? And he says, look, we've gotten ourselves into fiscal trouble. Everyone knows it. Everyone is skeptical about our capacity to fix the thing. I'm proposing to put myself in a straitjacket and follow these new fiscal rules. He'd win.
Yeah.
It would be a great campaign.
Yeah, I would agree, but personally, I'm seeing them in the kind of phase of denial, because like in every public kind of speech, there's government officials are saying that Montenegro is the fastest growing economy in Europe, that we are tiger in Mediterranean, that we are the best in Europe, and it's just like funny. I think they are kind of in this denial stage of what's going on.
If that's true, Miloš, I would say they're delusional.
Ok, profesor Hanke kaže da je tokom ove rasprave i samog sebe praktično ubijedio u to da su ova fiskalna pravila koja predlaže najvažnija stvar i preporučuje Milošu da neko, bilo ko god može, pozove Đukanovića na telefon i da mu to kaže. I profesor Hanke čak smatra da kada bi Đukanović pristao da uvede ova fiskalna pravila i da to javno objavi, da bi to maksimalno povećalo njegovu popularnost i da mu to definitivno donijelo pobjedu na izborima.
Vlada nije spremala na kraju, ali nema se.
So,
yeah.
Good to be with you all. Wish I was in Montenegro.
You're welcome all the time. We cannot send you 3 kind of limousines, but we can welcome you. And
as soon as we remove the lockdown, we'll come.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. We are going to officially close the stream, and then maybe we can just like stay a few more minutes.